bringing back into focus that emotion is what actually sells. And, you know, one of the things that was hardest for me to learn in timeshare, and I know not everybody can relate to this specific example, but when selling timeshare, in the beginning, I used to really hate getting engineers and highly analytical people, because the perception is, and there's truth to it, but the perception is they're harder to sell a timeshare to, because a timeshare feels like an emotional decision more than a logical decision. And I think you could make the argument that if you boil it all down, it is more of an emotional decision than a logical decision. In other words, it doesn't always make sense. People don't just buy a timeshare because it logically makes sense. But people buy timeshares all the time. And the majority of timeshare owners are glad they bought a timeshare. Not all of them. There are plenty of unhappy owners. There are a lot of people who feel like they were misled, lied to, whatever. But in survey after survey, the majority of people who buy a timeshare are glad they bought it, even if it didn't make sense, even if it didn't save money, even if it forced them to spend more money than they would have, even if it didn't work the way they thought it would, or take all that stuff into consideration, the majority of people are still glad they bought it. And the reason is because of emotion. Emotion is what sells. Now, if there's not enough logic, they will cancel. And I watched people who got really good at the emotion side and could sell people all day long, and then watch half of them cancel. So it doesn't do any good, right? You do have to have that balance and that logic that confirms the decision that they made emotionally. But when I would get these engineers, people would say, oh, great, it's an engineer. And in the beginning, I thought, oh, okay, so I have to speak to them in their language, right? They're an engineer, so I have to talk in engineer terms. I have to get logical with them, and that's the only way to win over a logical person. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Like, you're dealing with a certain kind of a buyer, and you think, okay, so I got to speak their language. They're analytical. They're an engineer. I got to talk that way, and I'm not saying that there's not a place for that, but what I learned was that's actually not the best way to sell them. Now, to be clear, there are points of that are true. Like, if I'm talking to an engineer, I better know what I'm talking about. Like, if I can't back up with logic, if I can't provide the data or whatever it is they want, or point them to what they want, or if what I'm saying is just flat out, you know, doesn't make sense, doesn't hold weight, and they're like, okay, you don't know what you're talking about, I will lose them. So there has to be underlying logic, but that's not what gets them to take action. You don't overcome logic with more logic. You actually overcome logic with emotion. And what I found was, the more you try to overcome logic with logic, thinking, and it's the right idea, like, oh, I want to speak their language, they're an engineer, they speak analytical, I'm going to be analytical, and that's how I'm going to win them over. It doesn't work. Think of it like home court advantage, right? I'm trying to go onto their home court and beat them, but they have the advantage. I'm not going to out-logic the logical person. The more I feed in with logic, the more their analytical brain is stimulated, the more they have to think about it, the more they have to ask more questions, the more that they have to process, the more that they have to take their time, step back, do research, all of that stuff, right? So while I have to make sense, and it's more important that my logic holds weight, you know, and holds, you know, it actually holds up to some scrutiny, right? I'm not saying that it throw logic out the window, but that's not what's going to get them to take action. It's the emotion that will get a logical person to take action. When you tap into why it matters, why they want to do something,